Introduction to Aesthetics, Part 21. The Artist's Intention and the Intentional Fallacy. The question of the artist's intention and its role in understanding and evaluating art is another important topic in aesthetics, one which has received a great deal of philosophical attention. On the face of it, the relevance of the artist's intention is plain. Consider a simple case. I commend a child on her drawing of an elephant, say, only to be told that she meant to draw a hippopotamus. Had she meant to draw an elephant, I would have been right in my identification, and the result would have been commendable. Given that she meant to draw a hippopotamus, in fact, I am wrong, and it is not a very good drawing. It looks like an elephant, not like a hippopotamus. And is it to this extent a failure, even if I very much like the final result? We may leave aside here another possibility, that the child was mistaken and misidentified an elephant and a hippopotamus. There are more sophisticated examples that make the same point. In the 6th stanza of Yeats' Among School Children, the first 4 lines run, Plato thought nature but a spoon that plays upon a ghostly paradigm of things. Soldier Aristotle played the tawse upon the bottom of a king of kings. In the first printed edition of this poem, the typesetter put soldier instead of solider, though some critics found soldier Aristotle intelligible, even ingenious. It is plausible to think that the military allusion makes little sense in the context of the whole, and is thus a poetic flaw. But this judgment on the poem's merits is overturned once we learn that this is not what Yeats intended. In short, it seems it is not only the poem and what we make of it that matters. The poet's intention is also relevant to an aesthetic assessment. Indeed, in this case, it is not merely relevant, but crucial. The same point may be made in a different way about music. In judging the merits of a composition, it seems essential to ask, for instance, about the instruments on which the composer intended it to be played. The authenticity movement in music insists that music should only ever be played on the instruments for which it was composed, and where necessary, these should be reconstructed. We need not go to this extreme to agree that a work intended to explore the timbre of one instrument should not be judged on its suitability for another, which might, of course, be a similar instrument of latter date and design. what was written for the violin might not sound so very good on the tuba. It is natural to generalize from examples like these and conclude that there is more to interpreting a work of art than merely putting a constructive upon its observable features and thereby giving it meaning. We also have to know about the intention of its author, what he or she meant. Very many critics, indeed, have gone much further and insisted that a wide range of biographical material is relevant to critical interpretation, family relationships, educational influences, and so on. Still others, notably Marxist critics, of course, have held that knowledge of the social and historical context in which a work was created is also of the first importance in reading it correctly. If any of this is true, then the freedom of the audience to find its own meaning in the work is severely constrained. An audience is no more free to make what it will of a play or a painting than a historian is free to construe the outcome of a battle in favor of whichever side he happens to favor. The Roundheads defeated the Cavaliers, whether I like it or not. How far do these additional factors, and especially the artist's intention, constrain aesthetic interpretation and evaluation? Is it comparable to the degree to which science and history are constrained by evidence? Can we make a mistake about a work of art in something like the same way we can make a mistake about a biological function? If we can, then it follows that the essential subjectivity of interpretation is an illusion brought about, perhaps, by the contingent fact that there is more debate about art than there is about science. In large part because people feel free to offer opinions about books, plays, and so on, where they would not feel free to offer an opinion in a scientific debate. Subjectivism is most plausible when we confine ourselves to reader response. But a properly critical approach to interpretation requires us to move beyond this. And if the artist's intention truly is crucial, then this means engaging in inquiry into what the poet or painter actually meant. The aesthetics of nature. It is important to note that there are two different contentions to be distinguished here. Although the practice of drawing upon the artist's psychological history as an aid to interpreting his or her work is commonplace, especially among literary critics, though it has its adherents in musicology and fine art too. The claim that biographical material is relevant or crucial is rather more ambitious than the simpler claim that artistic intention is relevant to interpretation. Indeed, the possibility of insisting upon a radical distinction between the two claims is importantly illustrated by example of Collingwood, for whom the mind of the artist is central, but who, as we noted in chapter 3, is scathing about criticism that has been reduced to grubbing around for historical tidbits. It is the second claim, about specific artist intention rather than historical biography, with which we are chiefly concerned here. This is partly because the significance of the artist's intention has figured prominently in philosophical discussion. The starting place for much of that discussion is a famous essay by W.K. Wimsatt and M.C. Beardsley entitled "The Intentional Fallacy." As the title of their essay suggests, Wimsatt and Beardsley are anti-intentionalists. That is to say, they hold that any evidence of the artist's intention drawn from outside the text is aesthetically irrelevant. Wimsatt and Beardsley's essay, as many commentators upon it have pointed out, is concerned with several distinguishable themes, some of which the authors are inclined to conflate. For instance, they are at pains to distinguish literary criticism from literary history, and to make the former autonomous from the latter. But, as we have just seen, it is consistent both to the stress the centrality of the artist's intention and discount other biographical material. A further feature of Wimsatt and Beardsley's essay is that it constitutes a sustained assertion of a point of view rather than an argument properly so called. It never sets out clearly the fallacy it means to expose, or explains quite what makes it a fallacy. Despite these uncertainties, their essay has attracted attention because they present those who think that the artist's intention is crucial with an important dilemma. Either the artist's intention is successfully realized in the work, in which case we need not look outside the text at all, or it is not, in which case the intention has failed and cannot, therefore, illuminate our understanding of the resultant work. A work of art ought, from the point of view of criticism, to be relatively freestanding. We have to be able to understand and appreciate works of whose originating intention we know nothing. Our knowledge of Chaucer's or Pierre Plowman artistic intention can only be informed by the text, since we have no other source. Even where we do know something of the author's state of mind at the time of composition, in the end, the justification of any interpretation must depend on the evidence of the text, canvas, score. Wimsatt and Beardsley are exclusively concerned with literature, but it is not difficult to extend their claim to artworks in general. This is confirmed by the fact that there could be no real ground to prefer an arcane interpretation which relies on biography but fits rather ill with the text over a plainer reading which makes most sense of the text as it stands. Aesthetic judgment may be undermined by the text, which is why intentionalists seek other constraints on interpretation. But it is to the text, nonetheless, that it must finally answer. Such is the burden of Wimsatt and Beardsley's essay. Yet, the dilemma they present does not completely rule out the value of independent information about the artist's intention. Such information may set the parameters of interpretation by, for example, establishing just what the text is, what instruments the score is for. This is only a starting point. This is what the example from Yeats illustrates. The defense of an interpretation must draw its evidence from the text, but we may first have to establish a common text, which is why the origins of the soldier variation are important. A further point of some importance is this: the content of a work is not always written on its surface appearance. Art, like science, history, and philosophy, is a tradition of activity. Artists of all kinds employ conventional devices of expression and representation. Moreover, they are often highly conscious of the tradition in which they work. T.S. Eliot is a particularly marked case. To understand his poetry, we have to know a good deal of the poetry and other literature that preceded it. This constitutes another reference point by which to discriminate between good and bad interpretations. The good ones are those that are alive to the resonances of the tradition. The bad ones are those that are deaf to them. Whether I like one interpretation better than another, I can only claim to have understood the work if I can take proper account in the reading I give of the detectable and determinable references it contains. No amount of freedom in attributing a personal meaning detracts from this necessity. There are then important facts to be accommodated and incorporated in arriving at a plausible interpretation of a work. And this puts limits on the claims of subjectivity. Personal taste is not the only or even the main consideration. Even so, it cannot be denied that there is evidently the possibility, indeed the recorded reality, of different and incompatible readings, each consistent with the text, score, etc., upon which all are agreed, and all apparently taking account of the extra textual elements of intention, convention, and tradition. It might seem, consequently, for all that has been said, that even making allowance for the role of artistic intention, we have still to admit the essential subjectivity of aesthetic judgment. In the end, we can only call upon our personal preferences. Does this really follow? What are we to make of different readings? And how, if at all, are we to adjudicate between such competitors? A further feature of the subjective-objective dichotomy is its all or nothing character. If we question this, then the possibility and perhaps eliminability of alternative readings need not imply the subjectivist view. To begin with, objectivism only requires a distinction between better and worse readings, interpretations. Some readings of text are strained and silly. Some performances of music are distorting. Some interpretations of paintings are far-fetched. Some theatrical productions are failures. These possibilities are compatible with a number of readings, performances, interpretations being equally good, but this neither shows that we must retreat to subjectivity. After all, they are equally good, nor does it reveal a peculiarity of art and the aesthetic. Underdetermination can occur in the sciences. Some philosophers think it unavoidable, but whether it is or not, so far as present evidence goes, several scientific explanations can be equally good. The possibility of several equally good interpretations of an artwork only shows that, as yet, there is no definitive interpretation. Perhaps the future will produce one that can be seen to supersede all the rest, or not. The important point is this: art is not different to science or history in this respect. The common picture of science or empirical history as invariably producing one right answer is a misperception of the reality. Even pure mathematicians whose sphere is preeminently the provable dispute and disagree, and often they have to leave the issues about which they disagree unsettled. Sometimes certainty is possible. Sometimes it is not. In maths, in science, no less than in aesthetic interpretation and evaluation, mathematical investigation, scientific explanation, historical inquiry, and aesthetic interpretation can all be conceived as the pursuit of truth, provided that we understand this as striving for better proofs, theories, narratives, interpretations, and not for some final best. No sphere of critical inquiry rests upon the idea, or supposes in practice that the last word has been said. It might be replied that this overlooks the fact of logical exclusivity. We may not, as a matter of fact, know which of two competing scientific explanations is correct. But we know that they cannot both be, since they logically exclude each other. Alternative interpretations of a work of art are not exclusive in this way. These are plausible claims to make, but their implications can be overestimated. Take a particular example. Very many cellists have performed and recorded Bach's cello suites in a variety of styles and with varying degrees of success, all of which are available for us to listen to according to preference. Yet it is widely agreed, however, that the cellist Pablo Casals has made a recording that trumps all the rest. A recording that may be said to be definitive, to date at any rate. Of course, this is a judgment that can only be sustained by musical critique. And in the absence of such a critique, I can only assert it. What seems to me true is that, excellent though many of these other recordings and performances are, Casals provides us with an interpretive performance that shows how Bach's composition is best heard. The same claim might be made for Jacqueline Dupre's famous recording of Elgar's cello concerto. Of course, it remains the case that many of the others are worth listening to. In this sense, they are not excluded by Casals' interpretation. But insofar as it is true that his is the best, they can be expected to lose some of their original attraction in its light. This is what it means, in my view, to say that his is the best. And though it does not sustain a conception of strict exclusivity, it allows us to say as much here as in many scientific cases. The best explanation need not exclude others. In the sense that they can be persisted with compatibly with the relevant evidence. But in the light of a better explanation, these alternatives lose a lot of their original plausibility. In short, the subjectivist is mistaken not in believing that artworks admit of alternative readings, but in supposing that this undoubted fact is peculiar to art and that it implies admission of failure in the pursuit of objective inquiry into artistic excellence. The only thing that would show subjectivism to be true is the impossibility of deciding between the better and the worse, and the unintelligibility of the idea that there could ever be a best interpretation, allowing for the interpretive impact of different contexts. Yet a familiarity with the real business of criticism in painting, literature, music, and so on shows there to be ample scope for just such decisions. The literary critic writes, and the musicologist comments on the presupposition that what he or she has to say sheds new light on hitherto unremarked parts of the text, composition, or performance. Any other presupposition would make nonsense of their activities. It takes no special expertise to swap opinions, and mere opinions have in any case no special claim upon our attention. Aristotle remarks in one place that we ought not to demand of any inquiry more precision than it allows. This is a cautionary reminder. Art is not science. Philosophy is not history. Politics is not mechanical engineering. Theology is not commercial law. Equally cautionary, though, is the reminder that we should not assume radical differences where we have no good reason to. The aesthetic is no more susceptible to ultimate rational adjudication than most other areas of human inquiry and reflection, and no less. Art critics, musicians, theatrical producers, scholars of literature, and so on, frequently dispute and disagree. So do scientists, mathematicians, historians, and philosophers. Sometimes, especially in the sciences, explanations are rendered wholly redundant by further inquiry. In the arts, this is less common, though not unknown. But so too is it in philosophy and history. Bearing this in mind, we have good reason both to acknowledge the provisional nature of aesthetic judgment and to deny the contention that, in the end, it is all a matter of subjective preference. The subjectivist, however, has a further arrow in the quiver. The argument to this point has relied on a considerable degree upon the idea of meaning. What, the critic asks, is the meaning of this work? How ought it to be interpreted? The answer lies in an attempt to construe it in a way that makes it intelligible and to render it as intelligible and interesting as possible. What, though, of those things to which it makes no sense to attribute a meaning, but which, nonetheless, seem to invite aesthetic judgment. Are there such things? It seems that there are, namely natural objects. Surely some of the things we value aesthetically, objects in nature, could have no meaning. We speak easily enough of beautiful faces and physiques, landscapes and sunsets, and so on. How are we to accommodate the aesthetic appreciation of nature within the framework of a philosophy of art that gives pride a place to intentional meaning and cognitive value? The aesthetics of nature. It is an interesting fact about philosophical aesthetics. While in some historical periods, nature as an object of aesthetic judgment has occupied a central place, at others it has been almost wholly ignored. In the 18th century, for instance, nature was taken to be the preeminent object of aesthetic evaluation, and what we call art only secondarily so. As we observed in chapter 2, it was Kant who developed this line of inquiry to its most sophisticated level in the idea of the aesthetic as a distinct contemplative attitude revealed in the activity of mind that dwells upon, for example, the form and color of a rose. One of Kant's own examples, in fact. In the following century, however, aesthetics came to focus almost exclusively on humanly created art, and indeed it may be said that, thanks in part to Hegel, by the mid-19th century, aesthetics and the philosophy of art were identical, or at least coextensive. In the latter part of the 20th century, interest in the philosophical investigation of an aesthetic appreciation of nature returned. An influential paper by R.W. Hepburn, entitled Contemporary Aesthetics and the Neglect of Natural Beauty, revived interest in the subject. And this interest was considerably boosted by the rise of the environmental philosophy, and with it, environmental aesthetics. In the light of the history of ideas, then, there is some doubt as to whether nature is or is not a proper object of aesthetic attention and judgment. In the 18th century, it was British writers and philosophers, not notably the Scottish philosopher Francis Hutcheson, 1694 to 1746, who first took the appreciation of nature to be the purest form of aesthetic attention. Their central idea was similar to the Kantian aesthetic, from which the modern concept of the aesthetic attitude is derived. They thought that the enjoyment from looking at nature arises from a certain sort of disinterestedness that sets aside personal, economic, and moral and religious concerns. For many people, this disinterested attention is a matter of apprehending the visual beauty of nature
and hence appreciating it properly. But the 18th century authors came to develop a distinction between the beautiful and the sublime. To appreciate the sublime in nature is to apprehend its power and majesty, its awesomeness, we might say, while distancing ourselves from the sense of fear and foreboding that dramatic landscapes, snowstorms, thunder and lightning, violent winds, and spectacular sunsets, and so on, naturally prompt in us. Such a disinterested attention to the sublime is to be contrasted with an appreciation of the beautiful in art. That is the intentional production of the delightful with words, paint, or music. Beauty in this sense is the outcome of a designing intelligence, nature. If we ignore theological conceptions, has no such intention behind it. And consequently, in nature, in the disinterestedness characteristic of the aesthetic, can only apprehend the sublime. There are a number of problems with this account of the aesthetic appreciation of nature. First, is this attitude of disinterestedness actually possible? Of course, we can describe a process of abstraction, the process of setting aside all practical concerns and personal connections as we look at a landscape. But it does not follow that what this process results in is a distinct or even a positive attitude of mind. Perhaps its logical extension is complete disengagement rather than disinterestedness. Indeed, it is plausible to think that, taken to its furthermost extreme, that this is exactly what will result. Since if every purpose and interest that we may have is excluded, what is there left to hold our attention? At a sufficient level of abstraction, disinterestedness and sheer lack of interest seem to come to the same thing. Second, even if there is some clearly distinguishable attitude called disinterestedness, is this the attitude we ought to bring to nature? To appreciate nature properly, it is arguable, we have to be engaged with it by seeing ourselves as part of it. Human beings are themselves part of nature, and so it is a mistake to draw a distinction between the human mind and the natural world such that the first is merely the contemplator of the second, by thus removing us from the natural world. The disinterested attitude confines us to our own mentality and does not allow us to reach across the boundary between the human and the natural. Yet, it is only when we cross this artificial boundary, it may be argued, that we come to appreciate nature properly. A third difficulty is this. Even if the disinterested attitude is possible, and even if it is not susceptible to the objection just considered, why call it aesthetic? This term, in its historical and contemporary use, is plainly applicable to works of art. If there is an aesthetics of nature, then it is also applicable to natural objects. And some have held it is indeed refined and purified when it is extended in this way. But what is the connection between the two? What makes both attention to art and attention to nature modes of aesthetic appreciation? As we saw in the discussion of Kant, it is not easy to answer this question. Disinterested delight seems to be the exclusive province of the spectator. It is the mind of the spectator that bestows the aesthetic character on that which it contemplates. If so, the genius of the creative artist is connected with it only contingently. We may happen to bring an aesthetic attitude to their creations, or we may not. For similar reasons, beauty is too thin an aesthetic concept to do much work here. Certainly, landscapes and other natural objects can be beautiful, but as we saw in an earlier chapter, beauty is one feature of the aesthetic, but neither its only nor its distinguishing feature.